Kusizangpola, welcome to Bhutan e-learning project. I am Sonam Wangmo from Mutithang Higher Secondary School. This is economic session for key stages 4 and 5. The topic that I have for today's lesson is on the determination of market price. So this topic is in continuation to the earlier lesson on the theory of demand and supply. This is because now we are going to look into how the two market forces of demand and supply determines the price of a commodity in the market. Now, before I begin my lesson, I would like to state the objectives, the main objectives for today's lesson. So at the end of the lesson, learners should be able to define the three basic concepts, that is equilibrium, equilibrium price, and equilibrium quantity. Number two, the learners should also be able to explain with the help of a graph how the prices of the commodities in the market are determined. Number three, the learners should also be able to explain the changes in the demand alone on the price and equilibrium quantity, and also the changes in the supply of a commodity on the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. The fourth objective I have here is the learners should also be able to explain the effect of simultaneous changes in both demand and supply on the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now, these are the objectives for today's lesson. Now, I would like to begin my lesson by explaining the three basic concepts. Number one is the equilibrium. Now, equilibrium in general sense, it means the state of balance or a state of rest. It indicates that the two different forces in the market working on opposite directions are brought to balance. It also refers to a situation where there is a situation or a position from where there is no tendency to change until and unless there are changes in the forces influencing the equilibrium. Similarly, in economics, equilibrium refers to a situation where the demand becomes equal to supply. The second concept that I have here is the equilibrium price. So the equilibrium price is the price at which the amount of goods that the consumers are willing to purchase becomes exactly equal to the amount of goods that a supplier is offering for sale. And the last concept that I have here is the equilibrium quantity. Now, equilibrium quantity is the amount of goods that are bought and sold in the market at the equilibrium price. So these are the three basic concepts. Now, let us look into the determination of price. Now, we are going to look into how the two market forces of demand and supply determines the price of the commodity in the market. So since you all have already, you are already done with demand and supply, I will not go into detail. Now, here basically I will be explaining two ways. So there are two ways to look into how you are going to determine the price of a commodity. So you can either use a schedule, a demand or supply schedule to explain the determination of price, or you can have a graphical presentation to explain. Now, here I have a demand and supply schedule for shoe. Now, if you look into this demand and supply schedule, you can see that there is an inverse relationship between price and demand for shoes. For example, when price increases, demand will decrease, and when price decreases, demand increases. And if you look at the relationship between price and supply, the relationship is direct, meaning when supply increases, normally suppliers produce more and supply more of that commodity in the market. Now, if you go by the definition of equilibrium price, so if you look into this demand and supply schedule, you can see that the price for a pair of shoe in the market is determined at neutrum 300. So this is the price for shoe that is determined, because you can see the demand for shoe is exactly equal to the supply of shoe. So these two market forces that moves in opposite direction are brought to balance at neutrum 300, where demand is equal to supply. Now, to have a better understanding on how the prices of shoe is determined in the market, or to have a better understanding on the determination of price, we will try to look into the reasons for why no other prices other than neutrum 300 in this case can be equilibrium price. Now, let's consider the prices that are higher to the equilibrium price. So let's take Nultrum 500. So at Nultrum 500, you can see that the supply of shoes in the market exceeds demand. So here we have a situation of excess supply, or you can also say it as surplus. Now when there is excess supply, when there is surplus of shoes in the market, now in order to get rid of this surplus or excess supply, or to attract more consumers, the price will decrease. So it will decrease till it reaches Nultrum 300, where the demand is equal to supply. Now let's look into the other case. Let's look into the prices that are lower to the equilibrium price. So let's say Nultrum 200. So now at Nultrum 200, you can see demand exceeds supply. So there is more demand. So in other words, you can say there is shortage of shoes in the market. So when there is excess demand, there is going to be competition among the buyers to buy this particular commodity, that is shoe. So this is going to put pressure on the price, and it will push up the price. So the price is going to increase, and ultimately it is going to settle at Nultrum 300, where demand is equal to supply. Now let's look into the market position. At Nultrum 300, the market position is equilibrium, which means at Nultrum 300, the demand is equal to supply. And at lower prices, that is 200 and 100, you can see there is excess demand. And at higher prices, at Nultrum 400, 500 and 600, you will see there is a situation of excess supply. Now we are going to look into the effect on the price at these different market positions. So we have the last column, that is the effect on price. So you can see at equilibrium, the price is going to remain stable. And when the market position, when there is excess demand, the price is going to increase. So this is the effect on the price because of these different market position. And when there is excess supply, the price is going to fall. Now, if you look at this, now when I say the equilibrium price remains stable, it is going to remain in that position until and unless there is changes in the demand and supply. So when there is changes in the demand and supply, this equilibrium price is subjective to change. So the effect of changes in the demand and supply on the equilibrium price will be dealt a little later. Now, this is one way of explaining the determination of price using demand and supply schedule. Now, you can also have diagrammatic presentation. In other words, you can use a graph to explain how the prices of the commodities are determined in the market. So here I have y-axis and x-axis. So on the x-axis, you are going to plot quantity of shoes in our example, and on the y-axis, you will have price. Now you have this, now we have the demand curve, which is sloping downward. So this downward sloping demand curve, as you already know, it gives us the inverse relationship between price and demand. And here I have the supply curve, which slopes upward, that indicates the direct relationship between price and the quantity supplied. Now at the intersection point where the demand and supply curve meets, we call that as equilibrium point. And the price that is corresponding to this equilibrium point, this Nultrum 300 is the equilibrium price, and 4000 is the equilibrium quantity. Okay, now at Nultrum 400, when prices are higher than the equilibrium price 300, we can see, now normally when price increases, demand decreases. So you can see the demand for shoe has decreased from 4000 to 2800. Now at a higher price, the supply would increase. So it has increased from 4000 to 5000. So at a higher price, that is at Nultrum 400, you can see supply becomes more than demand. So here, as I said earlier, we are going to have a situation of excess supply. So the excess supply is indicated by the distance between point F and point G. So the excess supply is by 2,200 pairs of shoes. So as I explained earlier, when there is excess supply, the price is going to decrease. The price will decrease. And let's look into prices lower than the equilibrium price, that is 200. So when prices are less, normally supply is going to be less. So it's 2,500. But at a lower price, the demand is going to be more. So it's 5,500. So here at a lower price, we have situation of excess demand. So, the distance between point A and B indicates the excess demand. So, the excess demand is by 3,000 pairs of shoes. So, when there is excess demand, the price is going to go up. So, ultimately the price for a pair of shoe is going to be determined at Newton 300, where demand is equal to supply. So, this is the second way through which you can explain the determination of the price of a commodity in the market. Now, after this discussion, we now know that the market forces of demand and supply has a very important role to play in the determination of price. So, it is neither demand alone nor supply that determines the price of a commodity in the market. So, in this regard, Alfred Marshall, the famous economist, said, just as both the upper and lower blades of scissor are necessary to cut a piece of cloth, similarly, both the forces of demand and supply are essential to determine the price of a commodity. So, in this regard, Alfred Marshall has regarded the two forces of market, that is demand and supply, to the two blades of scissor that we use to cut a piece of cloth. Okay, now we will look into the effect of changes, that is shift of demand and supply on the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Okay, so here under this we will look into two cases. The first one is we will look into effect of changes, that is shift in the demand alone on the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So, in this we are going to assume supply to remain same, but there are changes in the demand, and we are going to look into the effect of these changes in the demand on the price and equilibrium quantity. Now, here as usual you are going to have P as the equilibrium price, because it is determined at the intersection point of supply and demand. Now, since you are already done with the shift of demand and supply in the earlier lesson, now I would like you all to mention few factors that would result in the shift of demand curve towards the right, which indicates increase in demand. So, let us say factors like income of a consumer, taste and preference of a consumer, or price of related commodities would affect demand. It would change. So, let us assume that there is increase in the income of a consumer. So, when there is increase in the income of a consumer, the whole demand curve is going to shift towards the right. So, when it shifts towards the right, equilibrium quantity would increase. So, it has increased from Q to Q1. Now, when the demand curve shifts towards right from D to D2, at this initial equilibrium price, you can see supply has remained same at this point, but the demand curve has shifted towards right, which means here again we have situation of excess demand. So, when there is excess demand, as you already know, the price is going to increase. So, it will increase from P to P2. So, this P2 is the new equilibrium price that has resulted from the increase in demand because of increase in the income. Now, let us assume that the income of a consumer has decreased. So, when normally when the income of a consumer decreases, demand tends to decrease. So, the decrease in the demand would lead to shift of demand curve towards the left. So, when it shifts towards the left, the equilibrium quantity would decrease. So, it decreases from Q to Q1. And again at the initial equilibrium price, so the initial equilibrium price that we have here is P. So, at the initial equilibrium price, now this is your new demand curve, that is D1, and your supply curve has remained same at point E. So, here we have situation of excess supply. So, again you already know that when there is excess supply, the price would decrease. So, now this is your new equilibrium price, which has resulted from the decrease in the demand. Now, this is the first case. Now, let us look into the second one, where we are going to assume demand to remain same and now the supply would change. Okay, so, the equilibrium price is determined at P at the intersection of supply and demand. Now, let us since you are already again done with the shift in the supply in the earlier lesson, I would like you all to mention a few factors that would affect or that would result in the changes in supply. So, factors like the input prices, the prices for inputs that you are going to use to produce goods. So, prices of inputs, then the state of technology that you are going to use, then the price of related commodities. So, these are some of the factors that is going to influence supply. So, let us say that the input prices are less, or in other words, we have because of cheaper inputs, the producers are able to produce more and supply more. So, when there is increase in supply because of cheaper inputs, the supply curve is going to shift towards right. So, when the curve shifts towards right, since there is increase in supply, the equilibrium quantity would increase. So, here the equilibrium quantity increases from Q to Q1. Now, again at the initial equilibrium price, now you can see your demand curve has remained same here, there is increase in the supply. So, this much is the excess supply that we have at the equilibrium price, at the initial equilibrium price. So, when there is excess supply, the price is going to decrease. So, in this case, the price is going to decrease from P to P1 because of increase in the supply. Now, let us assume that the prices of inputs have now become expensive, it has increased. So, when the input prices increases, the cost of production is going to increase. So, when cost of production increases, suppliers will produce less and supply less. So, the curve shifts towards left. Now, when the curve shifts towards left, there is decrease in the equilibrium quantity. And again at the initial equilibrium price P, this is your new supply curve and your demand has remained same at point E. So, here you have a situation of excess supply. So, when there is excess supply, when there is excess demand, so this is the new supply curve, the supply has decreased, demand has remained same at point E. So, because of this excess demand, the price is going to go up. So, the equilibrium price is going to increase from P to P1. So, this is the effect of changes in the supply alone on the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Okay. Now, in reality, when demand for a commodity increases, there is also going to be increase in the supply. Simultaneously, there is going to be increase in supply when there is increase in demand. Now, we are going to look into the effects of simultaneous changes, that is shift in both demand and supply on the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So, as I said earlier, when there are changes in the demand for a particular commodity, simultaneously there is going to be also change in the supply. For example, if there is increase in the demand for shoe in the market, what the producer will do is they will try to produce more and supply more of shoe in the market. So, there is also going to be increase in the supply. So, now we are going to look into the effect of simultaneous changes in demand and supply on the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Okay. So, when there is changes in the demand, as I said earlier, there is also going to be changes in the supply. So, when demand changes, supply also changes. Now, as I said earlier, when there is increase in demand, there is also going to be increase in supply. Now, when we talk about the effect of simultaneous changes in demand and supply, the changes here would mean both. It can either increase or decrease. So, there is going to be increase in demand and supply or decrease in demand and supply. Now, in order to explain this, I will be taking a situation where there is going to be a simultaneous increase in both demand and supply. I am repeating again, I am going to take a situation where the effect of simultaneous increase, I am going to talk on increase, because later on the same analysis can be used to illustrate the simultaneous decrease. So, I will be talking only on the situation of simultaneous increase in both demand and supply and its effect on the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Okay. Now, when demand for a commodity increases, simultaneously there is also going to be increase in the supply of a commodity. So, when there is a simultaneous increase in both demand and supply, the equilibrium quantity would obviously increase. Now, when it comes to the price, when it comes to the equilibrium price, when there is a simultaneous increase in both demand and supply, the equilibrium price, the price may remain same, it might increase or decrease depending on the relative magnitude of increase in demand and increase in supply. So, here we have three possibilities. The first one is when the equilibrium price remains the same. So, we are going to look into when the equilibrium price is going to remain same. So, here I again have the x axis and y axis, so demand and supply curve. So, here the equilibrium price is P and the equilibrium quantity is Q. Now, we are looking into a situation where the equilibrium price is not going to change. Now, since we are talking about simultaneous changes in both demand and supply, we are going to have both demand and supply curve on the same graph. So, let us say that the demand has increased. So, the demand curve shifts from D to D1. So, that is the increase in the demand. Now, simultaneously with the increase in demand, let us say the supply of the commodity has also increased. So, in this case, since both demand and supply are increasing, the equilibrium quantity would increase. So, it will increase from Q to Q1. But look at the equilibrium price, it has remained same. So, this in this case, the equilibrium price has remained same because, as I said earlier, we have to look into the relative magnitude of increase in both, since we are talking about the effect of simultaneous changes in both. So, here you can see that with the increase in demand, the demand curve has shifted from D to D1. Simultaneously, there is also increase in the supply. So, the supply curve has shifted from S to S1. So, here now we have to compare the extent of increase in demand with the extent of increase in supply. So, the extent of increase in demand is exactly equal to the extent of increase in supply. So, if you compare the distance between two demand curves here and two supply curves, it is going to give us the magnitude of increase in both demand and supply. So, the magnitude, the relative magnitude is same in both the cases. That is why the equilibrium price has remained same. Now, we will look into the second possibility where the equilibrium price rises. Okay. So, the equilibrium price here is again P and the equilibrium quantity is Q. Now, let us say that there is increase in demand. So, demand curve again shifts towards right. Simultaneously, there is also increase in the supply. So, the supply curve shifts towards right. Now, when both increases, again the equilibrium quantity is going to increase, as I said earlier. Now, when it comes to the equilibrium price has increased in this case. This is because the extent of increase in demand, which is shown by the gap between these two demand curve. So, the extent of increase in demand is more than the extent of increase in supply. So, that is why the price has increased. Now, let us look into the last possibility, that is when the equilibrium falls. So, we are going to look into when the equilibrium price is going to decrease. Okay, so, again here there is increase in demand, the demand curve shift towards right. Simultaneously, there is also increase in supply, the supply curve shift towards right. So, when both demand and supply increases simultaneously, the equilibrium quantity would obviously increase. Now, here the equilibrium price has decreased. Again, the reason is because of the extent of increase in demand and supply. So, in this case, the increase in supply is more than increase in demand. That is why the equilibrium price has decreased in the last case. Okay, now we come to the end of today's lesson. So, before closing the lesson, we will quickly look into what we have learnt in today's lesson. So, in the first place, we looked into the meaning for different concepts, that is equilibrium, equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Then we looked into the determination of price, where we have two ways of explaining the determination of price. One is you can use demand and supply schedule, or you can also have a graphical presentation to explain. And in the third place, we looked into the changes in the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity when there are changes in the demand alone and change in supply alone. And then the last one that we looked into is the effect of simultaneous changes in demand and supply on the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now, when I say simultaneously changes, we looked into only one situation where there is simultaneous increase in both demand and supply. So, as I said earlier, this same analysis can be used to illustrate the simultaneous decrease in both demand and supply. Now, here I have two questions for you all to explore on your own. So, the first one is, what would happen to the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity when the decrease in demand is less than decrease in supply? The second one is, why will the equilibrium price of a commodity not change even if there is a decrease in both demand and supply? Now, with this, I come to the end of today's lesson. Thank you so much.